All right, so what is the tall poppy syndrome? It's a cultural phenomenon in which people hold back, criticize, or sabotage those who have or are believed to have achieved notable success in one or more aspects of life, particularly intellectual or cultural wealth. That is called cutting down the tall poppy. In fact, it's kind of popular in Australia and New Zealand, wherein they say cut down the tall poppy. When people are like kind of showing off about their success and achievements, they deliberately cut down. It's there in Japan and Netherlands and Chile and a lot in the UK too. Perhaps not so much in India, or it's not practiced so much in India. But in today's episode of Smarter With Sid, what we are going to look at is whether the tall poppy syndrome will impact you either one way or the other, whether you're the recipient of it or whether you're the giver of it, and how do you guard against being cut down. Let's go. Let me try and give you a little bit of context for why I'm choosing this specific episode to explore. Because I've noticed that a lot of us actually are victims of the tall poppy syndrome without even knowing that we are. So because I travel quite a bit, as you know, I'm traveling and I'm in the UK right now, and I'm observing how the UK works, not just as a society, but, workplaces and, generally social settings, and comparing and contrasting that with India. And one thing really strikes me is that when people are working in the UK, they are tending to kind of tone down whatever they are saying. They're not showing off. They're not like kind of talking about themselves all the time. They are certainly trying to avoid being the tall poppy in a very, very obvious way. Now, clearly, this actually means that the UK is a very conservative culture, and it's a place wherein maybe the hive mind is kind of encouraged, wherein people are working with each other rather than trying to stand out. They're trying to blend in and keep their head down and not being too noticed. If I compare and contrast that with India, let's say, I think we've been conditioned, and I'm stereotyping to a large extent, we've been conditioned to kind of speak our mind and kind of state our case and kind of stand our ground and kind of, make a bit of noise. And I think it's culturally more acceptable in India to show off, to be a little, braggy about your achievements. And actually, unless and until you talk in India, you're never going to be heard over everybody else's noise. And that is certainly not true for all of India, but certainly true for a lot of India, and especially India's corporate culture. So you will see the exact opposite of the tall poppy syndrome in India, wherein people are trying to shout over each other to try and be heard. Now, am I saying that that is wrong and being in the UK culture is right? Not really. In fact, if I see the US is kind of reflective of how India is. If I see, let's say, Australia and New Zealand, they're extreme. They're even worse off than what, let's say, the UK is. And Japan is also, again, another conservative hive mind. I think the critical aspect in setting this context for the tall poppy syndrome is to recognize the culture you're in and not be different from that culture unless and until you have the ability to be accepted first. I think that's the first lesson that I would, or the first principle that I would talk about. If you are somebody who's like, say, let's say from India going to the UK, you're going to experience kind of having to calm down, quiet down, go with the flow, be one of the crowd. And if you're going from, the UK to India, or even whether you're in India, but this is your first job, you will immediately understand, okay, I need to shout over here in order to survive. So first, cultural understanding is extremely important. But let's assume that you, let's say, are afflicted by the tall poppy syndrome, which means that you're used to talking about yourself and making yourself stand out. It's quite likely that even if you are in India, people may not like it. And I have noticed one very specific trait in a lot of companies in India and all across the world, wherein people are passive aggressive. They don't really let you know that you're getting on their nerves with your showing and standing out and, just doing a lot of what we call in common parlance shining, right? Quite interesting to note that that's what seems to be the colloquial term, especially in Maharashtra. Now, the funny thing is, when you are showing off, people may resent it. People may cut you down, but they may not cut you down very publicly. They will be passive aggressive. And I've noticed this in UK. I've noticed this in India. I've noticed this all across the world. People don't stand up to this tall poppy face to face and say, hey, you know what? Maybe tone it down a little, try and appreciate everybody else. What they will do is cut you behind your back. So watch out for all those people who are used to, talking about themselves. Take a step back and have an honest assessment as to whether you are being sabotaged in your career or in all the work that you're doing. Are you not reaching someplace as quickly as you think? It's quite likely that your co-workers, colleagues, partners don't have your back. The second thing is, if you are on the other side, wherein you are impacted by somebody who's shouting and yelling their achievements all the time, it's very tempting to kind of be passive aggressive and talk behind somebody's back. Yeah. And that is something that I would probably think is not going to either help you, because you are kind of conforming to the hive mind in the worst possible way, because what you're doing is that you're dumbing everybody down from an intelligence perspective or from an achievements perspective. And you are also kind of, going behind somebody's back, which is not a good value to have in any case. What I would recommend you do is to have an honest conversation with the tall poppy and say, hey, I really appreciate all the stuff that you're doing. I think wonderful. But is it okay, for me to give you some feedback? And I know it's a critical conversation. It's a crucial conversation, and perhaps not something that you can have with a braggadocio boss, but certainly you can have it with your colleagues and maybe people who report to you, because they will take a lot of airtime. And once the moment you speak it out, it's quite likely that the person has a blind spot about his own or her own being a tall poppy, and hopefully they will self-correct. But before going back or before going behind somebody's back, it's quite critical that we actually give this feedback to the tall poppy. Do remember, man is, and when I say man, I don't want to be politically incorrect, humankind is very political. And the reason why it's political is because we have to live within society, and there are contradictory urges here. One urge is to try and blend in, because we know somewhere instinctively that if we blend in, we work as a group and therefore we overcome the elements. But the second is hierarchically to stand out, because that's where we get the, the spoils and the riches. So it's always going to be a tussle, when to be a tall poppy, when to stand out, and when to kind of go within the crowd. And I suspect that most of us are doing it very, very unconsciously right now. The moment we probably will bring awareness to this tall poppy syndrome and how to manage it on either side of the fence, trust me, it's quite likely that we are on either side of the fence at different parts and times of our lives or different times of our work. It will just help us become better professionals and better human beings. What do you think? Well, I hope you liked this episode of Smarter with Sid. I'm trying to explore various ways in which we can become smarter about ourselves, about life, about, various management-y stuff too, and various growth hacks too. And if you got any specific episode that you want me to kind of delve into, just drop me a line. I'm the Traveling Professor on LinkedIn and on Instagram. And hey, do like and subscribe to this podcast. It really helps us, because, that helps us keep giving you more and more consistent content. And if you like podcasts like these, just go to IVM Podcasts and check out all the other wonderful stuff that they've got going for you. On that happy note then,